think we're here to talk about and to hear you, Tony, give us a little bit of your experience around complexity. And we've seen complexity. We see complexity all around us. This is a very complex time, certainly for the UN, as we're trying to navigate some of our input. Hello, everyone. Oh, do come in, please. We've only just started, so do come in. And Tony, one of the beauties, I think, of the complexity of the UN is that we're UNDP, as you know, but there's so many different agencies and there's so much capacity around the entire UN development system to address these complex issues. And I really think that over the next few years, that will be where the litmus test is. Can we get it together as a UN development system to address that? And complexity analysis will be quite important. We're also lucky to have John Hendra here today, and thank you for coming to this event. We normally have colleagues and friends from the UN across the street, and also from at times research institutes and academics partners. So thank you for coming. I think in the interest of time, maybe we'll go straight into the crux of the presentation. We heard about your work also through the work you did with the UN Data Lab, which is an interagency initiative. We've had 6 series of labs over the last year and a bit to try and really look at some of these complex issues around data. How can we equip ourselves as a UN development system with the best thinking and the best methodologies to see how to deal with data to help us measure and monitor the SDGs and provide policy options to our partner governments. That's where we really heard a lot about your input, and that's why we're fortunate to have you. So take it away. We'll have your presentation. We'll open up for questions, and included for those who are joining us online. Welcome again to you all, if you are.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bernard. That's very kind. Wow. Okay.
That is complexity.
That's what a screen share looks like.
Multi-layer complexity for you.
Right? I don't need to go any further than that. Okay. You're about to learn that my brains are in my feet. I have to stand as I walk and as I present, and I'll walk around. And I hope that I'm speaking loud enough for the mic to pick me up. If not, let us know, and I will sit down and I will behave myself. But I cannot promise. The other thing I am going to commit to, because I don't always manage this, is a lack of swearing. If I slip, I apologize in advance. Okay. This is a subject I get very passionate about. And when I get passionate, my language occasionally just slips. Today it's not going to, but I'm just going to cover the bases in case. I'm very passionate about.
Sorry,
it's coming through. Okay, good. The other thing is, I tend to get very excited, which means I also speed up. So for people, particularly for whom English is the second language, stop me when I get out of hand. Okay. The same goes if I've said something that's so abstract you can't work out what on earth I'm saying. Okay, I'm up for questions all the way through. Please don't wait till the end. So, my name's Tony. My background is I used to do communications for people like IBM, stuff like that. I got into narrative originally because I realized narrative was something important in terms of how we deal with populations and large groups of people. But subsequently I got into complexity. And I've spent the last few years working in places like Rwanda and Kyrgyzstan through a lot of the UNDP team out of what was the Bratislava office in Ukraine, now Istanbul, and many other NGOs around the world, bringing both narrative and complexity, because the two are very strongly interlinked. New practices in that to how we can look at what's going on, how we can make better interventions, all of that kind of thing. Today I'm going to focus mostly on the complexity side of things. I should say that often we run a 4-day course for people to go into this material. Okay. Occasionally we come up with really bright people who can handle it in a day. Okay. Ben told me that you guys could do it in an hour. So brace yourselves, because we're going to do this at pace. Okay. So it's always worthwhile, I think, just making some acknowledgements to start with. We're going to be just taking a very short peek into all of this. There is so much more we could do. There's so many more things I could talk, but this is just going to be a tiny little window into the world that is complexity. It's worth acknowledging there's a whole lot of things going on. These are many of the pieces behind it. we're not going to get to them today. Some of those you may be grateful for. Some of those you may be more interested in, which case grab me afterwards and I'll always talk about them. The one thing, this one can get really ugly. As you can imagine, I've seen more about Bangladeshi latrines than I ever need to see again in my life, but it's a great story. But we won't go into that in great detail today. It's also the case with all of this stuff that actually no one person is responsible for all of it. There's a bunch of people who've been working in this space behind me and before me, and it's worth just acknowledging some of those. And so at this point, I need to say thank you to a couple of people. So there's a lady called Irena Hoyt who works for Oxfam, Dave Snowden, who came up with a framework I'll show you in a minute. Clearly, it would be remiss of me not to mention Millie, who I worked with a lot on this, and Julio as well, for those of you who knew Julio beforehand. And it's always worth saying just hello to all of them and hello to Jason Isaacs. Now, the thing we're going to do today is look at complexity, if I can get this. There we go. We're living in a difficult time in comparison to what we thought we were living in. We all thought we'd got most things under control. And lots of things are not the way we thought they were. Often we're finding that the things that work really well, that we kind of got it down pat, we worked out what the method, what the process was, it's no longer working. We've reached the limits of those. It wasn't that they were wrong, but just no longer enough, because things have moved on beyond that. We're seeing that what was a past solution has actually now stimulated new problems that we're having to deal with. But we can't erase the past solution. It's there, it's happened, we've got to work with the consequences of it. And that's one of the big issues in complexity. You never get the opportunity to wipe the slate clean and start again. You start from where you are. It may not be where you wanted to start from, but it's what you have. And if you don't understand enough about where you're starting from, you will most likely bring in other problems that you never saw coming. Understanding where you are is a key point in all of this. Some of the things we thought we could shift seem to be not moving at all on the dial. We're making huge progress in all sorts of things around child poverty and other things like that, but then there are other things which seem to get stuck or indeed getting worse. And of course, we've got the SDGs that cut across all organizations that then falls into, hang on, which silo are we operating from, and the bureaucracies and trying to have that conversation and all the rest of it, which makes life more difficult as well. Now, the truth, as you'll see later in this, is actually that's a bonus. That's a benefit. Although I'll grant you, if you're working in it and having to negotiate the bureaucratic territories, it may not feel like it. But in terms of dealing with complexity, that is a plus. And the thing about all of this is it's not that our old tools don't work. They just don't work in this space because the world continues to evolve past where we've managed to get to. And the thing, of course, is that not all problems are complex. And that's one of the problems I often find in organizations. Someone's come across complexity. Everything's complex. We must all understand complexity and run complexity on everything. No, some problems don't fit into complexity, and it's really important to understand the boundaries of that. Some things really are simple. They're often the ones that we sort of tick off first on our task lists because we can get them done and that's complete. But it's important to recognize that. And for that, I use a framework, a particular framework called the Cynefin framework. Okay, so, Cynefin is a Welsh word, which means that you can put this up in any country in the world and just about everybody, apart from a very small population in one region of the UK, will go, how the hell do you pronounce that? So it's Cynefin. It's not Cynefin. And all the other variations that jump to mind, and I know what that's like. Now that you know how to pronounce it, you're part of the secret club. Okay? Probably a handshake you have to sort out later, but we'll get to that. Now this is built by a guy called Dave Snowden. He came up with it a few years ago. It's a way of looking at the problems we've got and working out what kind of a problem we're dealing with, what kind of a situation and environment we're working in. We talk about 5 key domains here. It's just a way of looking at the problems and working out what they are, and therefore what kind of responses we need to look at. So the first one we have, simple or obvious. Okay? Now those are the really easy ones. Cause and effect are apparent to everybody. Okay? So if I let go of the pen, what happens? It drops. Okay? That happens the same everywhere. It happens the same no matter what country I'm in, no matter what part of the planet, anything, or who's doing it. Okay? So there's a very simple thing there. What we typically do is we sense what it is, we categorize it. I mean, the idiot at the front is clumsy. And we respond. We go, don't drop the pen. That's easy. In that world, you can have best practice, but you have to be sure that it applies everywhere universally, both geographically, over time, everything else, and everybody understands the same. And sometimes what looks obvious in one place isn't obvious in somewhere else. I had an experience of that recently. So at noon, where is the sun? For those of you who... So I grew up in the Northern Hemisphere. I was a Cub Scout for many years. So one of the simple things I know is at noon, the sun is in the south, due south, always. So I flew recently to a new city, and I'd been given a box of chocolates to give to my hosts. And I arrived early in the morning, and I put them in the windowsill, and I realized, oh, hang on, it's facing south. I better not put it there because it'll melt at noon. I'm in Australia. Australia, the sun is in the north at noon. So what was obvious and happened the same every time, every day, no matter how old I was and when, suddenly switches. So it's always worth being aware of that, because that can cause problems. But that world, we have plenty of things, plenty of tools and ways of thinking about those problems. It's easy. Up here, it's still ordered, still cause and effect, but they might be separated by things, either process or time or geography. But in this world, we know if we follow these steps, we get this result. And there are things that fit into that pattern. Small differences at the beginning get ironed out as you're going through. You might meet people up here who can either analyze the problem and come up with what the answer is, or who've got expert knowledge. But they will have the answer. The answer will be the same no matter where you are, and it's predictable. Between these two, so we could talk about if I'm riding a bicycle and the chain breaks, that's a simple one. I can see that, I can fix it. Okay. If my car breaks down, yeah, that's beyond me. I'm going to need someone who's an expert. So I take that in to get fixed. But they will have the answer. So there you've got good practice. It's not necessarily one single way of doing it. You might have multiple ones. But in these places, differences don't really matter, as in where you are or who you are and what's happening. You can recognize what it is. And it's predictable. We know what's going to happen with pretty good confidence. So we've got three other domains to look at. Chaotic is one that we sometimes feel we're in, let's be honest, in organizations. Strictly speaking, we're probably not quite. In chaotic terms, for mathematicians and philosophers, it's completely random with no constraints. But chaos is something we're familiar with enough. It's something that actually takes a lot of energy to create real chaos. And what you quite often find is that it doesn't last very long. Very quickly, if you're in chaos, patterns start to emerge. Somebody will take charge, or things will start to happen without, and if you don't direct it, that can be problematic. So in this world, you're taking a different stance. You're not waiting to sense what's going on. You're acting to create stability here. And then you can look at the reaction of that, and then you can respond. And those tend to be fairly rare. They tend to be quite temporary. Because what you often find is this domain starts to kick in, the domain of the complex. Now, the domain of the complex, you've got so many things happening. Cause and effect is interacting. There are feedback loops. What you did yesterday shapes something that happens today, but actually then that shapes something else altogether that you thought you relied on yesterday. So it's very difficult in this world to predict what's going to happen. Small changes at the start can produce radically different outcomes at the end, very different impacts. And it's not predictable. There might be patterns in here, but it's not the same every way. We're often familiar with that at sort of a personal level. So I have two teenage daughters. Okay. I get up in the morning and they're both up and dressed and ready to go. They head off to school. I get in the car, drive to the train station, head up into town for meetings. That's a good day. If, on the other hand, I get up in the morning and one or both is wearing Velcro pajamas, has to be peeled out of bed, forced out the front door, and comes back in 2 minutes later going, I've missed the bus. Can you drive me to school? And then I go to the train station. And we all know that for all, however professional we may be, We're already in a space. You know the feeling? And we react differently in that space. It's inevitable. Yeah, we're all very good and we all iron those differences out and we be as effective as we can. But how friendly you are with your colleagues may depend on how many cups of coffee you've had this morning. Okay. That's a complex system. It responds to tiny things. And in this world, we have to look at it very differently. It depends on the perspective you bring to the problem. It depends on the geography of the problem, the psychology and the sociology and the way people think and the patterns they bring to it. As human beings, as particularly as professionals the way we are, the perspectives we're bringing to every problem we see are massively influenced by our education, by our professional training, by the conversations we have at coffee machines. All of that shapes how we view everything. So you bring in one problem and you talk about it in this room amongst us, would have a different reaction than if you went, say, down to the other end of the island. And same problem in the room, people would bring a totally different perspective and see it radically differently. And that's part of the problem with complex things, because you cannot predict, because you cannot, it is so dependent on human perceptions, you have to work to evolve it. We talk here about probe, sense, respond. You don't go in and do one thing that you intend to do forever from this point. You try something. This is the world of the pilot project, where you have to then watch what comes out, and you might be able to stabilize it and bring it maybe over here into this, so that becomes a process over time. But that's a big ask, and it's not often that happens. Now, the thing that I've often found is, when I take this into places, I take this framework and I give them problems to look at. Some people identify some problems as being simple, some being complicated, but they all identify different ones in each area. So you can see, for instance, in Singapore, we did it with the civil service over there. The defense guys tend to see things as fairly complex. The home guys, the justice guys, Home Office, Justice, Law and Order, for them, everything's, well, it's black and white. And one of the other problems you have up here is a thing called retrospective coherence, which is you look back on what happened, not when you've had a bad result. You look back down the complex chain of events, and you go, that's where it went wrong. So you put in place a process to make sure that never happens again. But you know what? It was never going to happen that way again, anyway. It happened that way that once. But that's how you also accrete bureaucracy, just bit by bit. Retrospective coherence here, for instance, for those law and order guys, they keep having investigations when there was a problem. And then they see what the problem was and they put in a new law to stop it again. Does that stop it? No, because the minute you do it, human beings, human systems, we find ways around our bureaucracies and our laws if we care enough about what's going on. In this space, humans matter more than rules. You cannot rely on them. Now, there's a fifth domain in the middle there. We call it the domain of disorder, which effectively is usually the domain of, I don't know enough about this problem. I can't see where it sits out here. And often, I think that's a problem of, we talk about it being at the wrong level of granularity. It's because we've actually put too many problems into one big basket, and we've stuck a nice abstract label on top of it. But actually, we need to start breaking it down a little bit and to work out what are the core elements here. So this framework is really important in working out when we're looking at a problem, what actually we're looking at and how should we approach it. Because if you apply complicated tools for complex problems, it gets worse. If you apply complex tools for complicated problems, you're wasting time and all sorts of things. Like the example I have of that, and I have to be slightly careful because this is being broadcast, but I'm going to bank on the fact that my mother is never going to watch this video, which is she has an iPad. Every once in a while, she has a problem with the iPad. And before she comes to me, or more often one of her grandchildren, to say, how do I fix this? And they can go, it's often obvious or simple, but actually they talk about it as it's complicated to help her understand. But she's been trying bloody everything in the first place for weeks, trying to fix it, which was a waste. So treating everything as complex, when actually it's complicated or obvious, is a mistake. But we tend to do a lot more here, and And we've got a lot more management practices and things we've talked about for decades that sit in these two. And it's only recently we started to recognize this. This is radically new. I mean, a number of years ago when I was doing my MBA, that just did not exist. And I felt massively frustrated because I couldn't work out why everything I did in my organization seemed not to work the way I planned it. Well, yeah, planning's a lovely thing if you're in this space and you can plan it. Complex has too many factors that you cannot see. So you have to work with it. Just making sense so far. The other thing you've got to be careful with is what we call here the catastrophic cliff. The catastrophic cliff is these boundaries here are they're relatively permeable. It's useful to know you crossed over, but it's not the end of the world. This one, on the other hand, if you keep doing the same thing and you've got a set best practice that works every time and you've done it for years and you haven't noticed the world around you has changed, if you fall over that cliff, that's a disaster, that's a crisis. You can take people over deliberately to create innovation, that's a different thing. But if you go over without awareness, you run into all sorts of problems. The example I often talk about is in the UK when we had the phone hacking scandal with News International. So actually it was a known problem. For years, people would go to those newspapers and say, "You've hacked my phone," and they had a best practice. It's called cash. Here's some cash. Sign this contract saying you'll never speak of this again. We're done. Worked for a number of years, but what they didn't recognise was the world around them. The attitudes had shifted, and finally somebody came to them and said, "You've hacked my phone," and they went, "Ah, we know how to do this. Have some cash. Sign this." And you see this in organizations, their first reaction is reinforce the rules harder. So have more cash. No, your problem is getting bigger by the minute because you haven't seen that the landscape of attitudes has changed around you. And at that point, you're in complete crisis mode. So you have to be very careful. We talk about very rarely putting things into best practice, into the obvious and simple mode, because you want things to go in here which are going to change only on geological timescales. You have to be really confident that that is stable and unchanging. The minute it's not, you're in trouble. So, that's fun. So, I'm going to focus now on the complex side. Okay? You guys have got enough for the obvious, the simple, and the complicated. In this place, the small differences can have big impacts. Who here has worked for the UNDP for a decade or more, or 5 years or more? Okay. Before you came in, you would have worked for other places. And things that worked in that space didn't work here. One of the things I see often, you'll all see this, what works for you in one organization, you then move to somewhere else, and you go, but we used to do it this way. Why this way? And tiny differences can make a big difference. Huge impact at the end of it. So you've got to be careful of that in complexity. In complex problems, the ones we're dealing with in countries, in regions, they continue to change. By the time if you spend too much time analyzing your problem, that was last year's problem, you've got a new one on your hands anyway. I got involved in a conference a couple of years ago about online radicalization, when, bless them, there were a couple of academics there who said, well, if you fund us for 2 years, we can do the research on the sites where they're going to get radicalized, and then we'll have the solutions. And about 3 of us behind the scenes going, 2 years. Those sites will be gone in 3 months. We will have brand new technologies by then. It'll be a brilliant answer to a very old question. So you cannot afford to wait too long. Analysis paralysis, as they used to call it, is a really big problem in this one. It doesn't mean you're going blind, but waiting too long to come up with a perfect answer will get in your way. Perspective matters. Also important. We talked about the way perceptions carry on. As human beings, our decision-making is based on patterns we hold in our brains. There's some work by a guy called Gary Klein. Patterns we have in our brains which come from micro-narratives, the bits of stories that we've heard all our lives, both filters information out, so there's plenty we don't notice, but it also allows us to go, oh, I recognize this situation. So those patterns inform what we see as the problem in the first place. Perspective matters hugely. And the other problem with complexity is it doesn't scale or repeat that well once you transpose it from its original position, from where it started. Because of those initial conditions might be different. Conversation Giulio and I had many years ago. He talked about the standard approach tends to be, we'll run some pilots and come up with a really good fish. Many of you probably heard this. He says, then the organization then goes, we need to do more of that, so we'll just put more money in making a whale. And he's going, doesn't work. What you want is a shoal of fish that can all adapt slightly to wherever they end up. It doesn't mean you can't do some things that are, let's look at the underlying structures, but you don't just take it and repeat it. And the other thing about complexity is prediction is impossible within limits. And I say that because you cannot necessarily predict what will happen, but sometimes you can give very good indications of what won't happen. I'll show you some examples of that as we go through. You can see in people's dispositions, they're not likely to do that, unless it's under extreme circumstances. We talk in human systems, we need to understand the disposition of the system, as in how is it now? What are the patterns? What is it inclined to do? And their propensity, which is where is it possible it might go in the future? And there will be some which we propensity is that this is a place it is not going to go. And if that happens to be where you're trying to take them, that's a real tough call. And typically in complicated situations, we come up with rules. We're all familiar with junctions a little like this. But the problem about the rules is when you've designed it from the center and you're not adapting to what's going on, people find their ways around the rules. As you see more exceptions coming up and you just change the rules slightly, just say, okay, we'll be able to take that into account and we'll add something else to it. And it gets a little bit more difficult and a little more difficult. And gradually it becomes so convoluted, nobody actually understands it. And then after a while, everybody gives up trying to follow it in the first place. It's not an effective way of dealing with complexity. Heuristics can be. Heuristics are rules of thumb that you think about and you apply, but you don't stick to them all the time. One of the rules of thumb you want in a complex situation is, what's the rule that tells you the rules are now out of bounds? And what do you do the other side of that? Because you need something to operate. So, if we're going to work in complex adaptive systems, which are going to continue to evolve, there's a bunch of things you have to do. You cannot afford to address a problem directly. Okay, we call it obliquity. There's a great article, must be about 10 years ago, in the Financial Times by an economist called John Kay, who then wrote a book about it. It's a really good book. The article's also very good and shorter, which for me is a bonus. I can send you a copy if you want afterwards. It says that if you go after a really complex, difficult, intractable problem, and you name it and you go after it directly, you create far bigger knock-on consequences, and you're unlikely to ever resolve the problem itself. You'll disrupt the system and you will cause untold damage in many cases. He uses the example of, he's an economist, so he uses the example of companies that in the 90s went from their core value was we work in chemicals or aviation. And in the 90s went for the whole fad of, well, we need to re-engineer to create shareholder value because that's what we do. So they went after shareholder value directly. One of them killed the company, disintegrated within a couple of years, despite the fact it was one of the biggest in the world at that point. Another one damn near killed the business. If what they were doing is, okay, shareholder value is something we want to create, but let's do it as a side effect of what we're doing over here. In obliquity, and I speak, I've already mentioned my teenage daughters, I've learned not to give too many direct instructions to teenagers. Okay. Instruction, don't walk away while I'm talking to you, generally has a pretty negative effect. And we do have a habit of when we come up with big things that we think are important, we'll go at it directly. Just say no. All of that stuff. You cannot work with that in a complex system. Instead, what you do is you look at what is affecting that problem, what are the other parts of the ecosystem involved, and then we start to tweak those. And you have to tweak multiple ones in parallel. That's critical. This is not RCTs. You cannot run RCTs, particularly in a complex system, because if you treat something here, that thing is also going to be affected. Therefore, you have to run them together, which makes it difficult to work out the causality, but in a complex system, they are often non-causal anyway. You're looking at emergent effects of multiple things going on. Looking for the cause is not always futile, but it's not always as helpful as you might think in a complex system. So, if you're going to work in this, go for things around the main problem that you want to hit, not the main problem. A good example is actually the work that you guys are doing in Oman at the moment around sustainable livelihoods in Jordan. Now I know, because of what we're doing, there are elements of that that are involved with PVE. Well, yeah, but you don't go after PVE directly. You go after it by looking at what influences it. The other thing about complex apps is you need to get as many different perspectives on the problem as you can, preferably from people who are really involved in it. If you just sit as experts, and experts have so much use, it's brilliant, but they have limits. I can think of the 3 or 4 projects that we've run. The Bangladesh retreat being a really good example, where expert opinion was, it'll be something like this, but can you do the research and find out? And the research came back with something that was so out of left field. So that the project there was, how do we persuade people to install, maintain, and use a healthy latrine, hygiene latrine? They wanted to identify, they said there were 3 key messages, which all the academic literature says it's these 3 things. It reduces risk, particularly for women. It reduces disgust. It reduces illness. Which of these messages, or what combination of those, is going to be most effective at getting people to install a latrine? We did the research, and the stuff that came back went, marriage is actually the thing you want to focus on. You install a latrine, you've got a better chance of a good marriage, or a happy marriage. Happy might be overstating it, but that makes sense in retrospect. Going in, the experts have nothing on their cards about anything like that, and I've seen that in a number of cases. And it's not because they don't know, they do. So what you want is material from the ground, from real people, that allow you, with detail and context and action and experience, rather than abstract concepts. And that's not hard to do, but it's essential in a complex system. Experimentation. In a complex system, you cannot know what's going to happen, so therefore you probe. You run experiments. It doesn't mean you try anything, you try it sensibly. It doesn't mean you have to anticipate failure. I loathe so much of the stuff I see coming out of Silicon Valley saying, fail often, fail fast. No, you don't need to. But what you do need to do is go in and run experiments, prepared for the fact it may not go the way you expect it to, with that anticipation and preparing for that. So safe to fail. Actually, one of the more difficult things often in systems is actually what happens if it succeeds. Because we ran a probe and then we thought we'd sit back and consider things, but actually that's gone so well it's taken off and we can't keep up with it. So you plan for that as well. The other piece that is not uncommon coming out of experimentation, and this is critical in innovation, is it may succeed, but not on what you thought you were testing. You may see something coming out that has a really beneficial effect, but if you're focused on, well, we only wanted to look at it for this, but actually this is happening, which is really healthy, but it's not that. If that's all you're measuring, you think the experiment's a failure. It might have been something that was immensely useful, but it was not what you planned. To give you an example from, let's just say, the other side, a few years ago, Al-Qaeda produced an online newsletter for new recruits at one point. Okay? And they put it out for a couple of months, and it was just rubbish. So new recruits, by all accounts, not personally, just went, this is no good. But what they discovered was the Western media and newspapers and TV stations would get hold of it and would then be up in arms. So hang on a minute, it's rubbish for our new recruits, but it's brilliant at poking the hornet's nest. So if they'd only been looking at that result that they were looking for with the experiment, they would never have spotted what it was useful for. Innovation, you've got to look for that. We call it exaptation. And of course, if you're running experiments, you've got to have a good feedback mechanism. If you don't know if it's going well or badly, you should not be running an experiment in the first place. In an ideal world, you want to have that, and you also want to have something ready, whether it's resources or plans of how you stabilize what you're doing or how you amplify what you're doing at the same time. How do you improve it once you've detected the success? But these are critical elements in any complex system if you're working with. You've got to go indirectly, you've got to go different ways, experiment, and you've got to have proper feedback. I feel like I'm doing an awful lot of talking. Is this actually helping and people are just, or have we dozed off yet? Okay. The other thing you may find, and there's a lot of people, certainly over on the West Coast, who do a lot of this, is they will model complex systems. And modeling complex systems is great for simulation. Sorry, I've forgotten there was a sound on that. So it's a nice sound. So it's dead easy. Oops, that was quicker than I thought. It's dead easy to model a flock of birds. There are only 3 rules, which is match speed with the bird nearest you, avoid collision, fly towards the center of the flock. That's great for simulation. It doesn't predict what's going to happen when it reaches the mountain. Is it going to go left or right? Simulation is helpful to get people used to the idea of things being complex. It won't help them actually work out what's going to happen next. And the other thing about all of this, we talked about this, but what evolved, when we talk about complex systems, is evolving the whole time, and other things co-evolve, behaviors and structures, whether it's social structures or physical structures or anything else, they all co-evolve together. You can't take one piece out and expect everything else to keep moving. And if you take something that worked really well in one environment, but that it evolved from that, and you try and rebuild it somewhere else, it really does not have the same effect. Okay. It's one of the problems. Okay, this is vaguely political, and I get that, but trying to impose democracy on places where they have not evolved their own version of democracy, I would have to say is going to fail. I think there's some evidence for that. I'm not sure I want to make it as a completely blanket statement, but I think that's a good example. So, if you're looking at a complex system, yeah, running experiments is lovely. What the hell do we run? What do we run the experiments about? I was trying not to swear, and I was so close. In a complex adaptive system, we talk about a number of things that are critical. So constraints is one. Now, constraints are both the things that stop you doing some things, but they're also the things that you have to do that enable you to do others. So we talk about a number of different kinds of constraints. We talk about rigid constraints. Okay? I can't get any further than that window right now. That's a pretty rigid constraint. We talk about governing constraints, which tend to be things that, so a rigid constraint tells you the only things you can do. A governing constraint, and this is oversimplifying, but a governing constraint tells you the things you cannot do. So most systems say you are not allowed to do this, but within that space you can still do what you think is best. We talk about enabling constraints as constraints around which other things can happen. So if we have a weekly meeting of all the different agencies coming together, okay, that's a constraint because it has to happen. But around that, all sorts of other things can evolve and emerge. And those constraints are really important. Most organizations look at you constraining people not to do things or just to do certain things. I've just done some work in Silicon Valley where we were looking at software engineers who had this perverse thing that they kept saying, we think we've got a little bit too much autonomy. And of course, for them, they're like, well, they hate us telling them what to do. Well, I get that. That's one kind of constraint. What they need is enabling constraints. It says you've got to sit down every week and talk with each other and work out what happens next. Okay, that's a constraint, but it's not a rigid one. We talk about attractors. Attractors are patterns of behavior we fall into in human systems. They're not things that necessarily pull us in, but just without thinking about it, our habit is that we fall into doing the same thing again. Oh, here we are. You can have a number of different kinds of attractors. The literature on attractors will talk about single-point attractors where you just spiral into the middle bit by bit, like a bowl. You throw a ball into a bowl and eventually just settles. And in some systems, you'll see that happening. In others, you might see dual attractors, dual-point attractors. Typically, we talk about predator and prey. So if you've ever seen a graph of the number of leopards versus the number of antelopes, one goes up, the other goes down, and there's a constant equilibrium like this. And then we have the really fun ones, which are strange attractors, where you might see a pattern rough emerging over time, but it never repeats. And all of these things are things that every society I've ever looked at, I've looked at a number of them now, using complexity and narrative systems, using SenseMaker. Every society I've ever known has a different idea of what justice is. Now that's a really complex attractor, because everybody, that has to inform a whole lot of behaviors, both natural and official and legal. But they're all different in every country. I'd argue in some cases it's different by areas within the country. And if you don't understand those attractors, you may be trying to push people to things that just are not feasible in that system, in the way it currently stands. We talk about modulators in a complex attractor system. Instead of, in the old systems theory stuff, people talk about drivers. No, we talk about modulators because there's so many things interlinked that are influencing what we're doing and how we're reacting to anything. So if I were to ask you how your day is going, what are the multiple things that impact on the answer to that question? How you feel about your work today? Because it could be where we are in the monthly cycle and when the next paycheck's due in. It could be anything to do with how many coffees we've had this morning. How many arguments have you had on the way into work or at work? Yeah. Have you got the one piece of information you really needed? There are so many things that influence what's going on in that system. And all of those are modulators that any one of them you need to tweak to start to explore. So if you run experiments, one of my favorite things, one of my recommended things is to run experiments around the modulators that you think affect the goals, not around the goals themselves. So you're running experiments to see what happens when we start to shift these patterns. It's all you can do, really. Identities matter in a complex system because actually we shift identities as human beings as well, from moment to moment, depending on the context we're in. Right now, we're all in a particular identity. But by the time we get home tonight, we'll have another identity going on. At some point today, I'm going to switch between my identity as a consultant and my identity as a son, because my mother's arriving in New York tonight.
Nice.
So that's going to be great. But
with your iPad.
That's good. There was a thing I can remember years ago that sometimes you get caught between two radically different identities in the same space, and it's a shock. I had one when I joined IBM. We had the annual Christmas party. I'm talking to my boss when my new girlfriend arrives. He goes, "Hi, sweetie, how are you?" And I'm caught between trying to be very familiar and loving and all the rest of it, and pet names. And yeah, I think that's a really serious problem. How do you negotiate that landscape? The identities switch, and we're very good at switching them, but when you're stuck in two identities at one time, that can be really difficult. But it's also for human beings. If we're dealing with a particular problem like PVE, like radicalization, how many identities do the people we're looking at hold? And are we looking at individuals or their identities and roles? And those matter. Pulling them in one identity reduces the time they spend in another identity. So that can all have an effect. And of course, with all of this, the context matters massively. Where you're doing it is huge. The landscape you're doing it in is huge.
Hi, I'm Neetha. By the way, I work for UNFPA. Thanks for having us here. I was wondering where incentives fit into this, because, and not just at the individual level and experiences through all of these, but as an institutional incentive structure, and that's definitely something that's pertinent to the UN, especially in a headquarters environment, and a dealing with bureaucracy and incentive structures in a complex system. So yeah. So
incentives are actually different. The research, which whenever I repeat it, I have colleagues from HR and other places who ask me not to. Because the research shows that if you put an extrinsic reward on something that should be intrinsic motivation, you destroy the intrinsic motivation. It's really hard. It's an apocryphal story, but it's, you've got bunch of kids are coming down the street. There's an old guy sitting on his steps, and as they're passing him, they swear at him, and they just abuse him. And he goes, "Oh, it's not creative enough. Come back tomorrow, try again. I'll give you all $1." So they come back the next day, and they come back the day after. And you go, "Okay, yeah, here's your $1." After a week, he goes, "No, not bad, but I've only got 50 cents on it. Yeah, I'm not going to bother anymore." Do you know what? Putting the reward on destroys the intrinsic behavior. There is starting to be seen that when you give kids gold stars for doing their chores, they're less inclined to do the chores the minute you go, "You're too grown up for gold stars now." It's really tough, but that can be very difficult. Therefore, what you need to do in here is you're trying to evolve the identity and the motivation at the same time, so that it becomes habit as much as anything else. Often, you might look for other kinds of incentives. Those are extrinsic ones that are evident. You might want to look for other ones that allow people to step up and move forward in other ways. That's the way you would want to do it. Does that answer the question, or if I just take it in a completely different direction?
No, it was the asking about how, if a system is not incentivized for change in some ways, or like the incentives are extrinsic so much that where is the push to adapt, or the, feeds into the inertia to change. So your answer about like trying to cultivate other kinds of motivators that are more intrinsic is what I understood.
Can I ask you, in a minute, you'll see some contour maps in about 4 or 5 slides time. Can you ask again at that point? I will try and remember to say it anyway, because one of the things is you want to look. So one of the things about a complex system anyway is you can't go, "Here's where we need to be, let's engineer how we get to there." Okay. In a complex system, we talk about you use the adjacent possible next step. Where are we now? Where can we feasibly nudge this system to take a step in what we regard as a generally positive direction? Take that. Okay, now assess again. Oh, that's opened up something else we can push that way. So you're not trying to push it against a way that it's not inclined to go, or having to try and create an incentive. There needs to be some kind of a draw, but what you want to look for is the natural ones that you can shape.
I just want to do a quick time check.
Yeah.
We have about 15 minutes.
Okay. I need to speed up. Thank you. So I talked about running experiments around modulators and things. This was obviously I've just changed these titles. This is for a different project, but essentially it's if you've got multiple goals, you don't want to look at the goals as individual things. You want to try and come up with a whole load of what are all the different things you're thinking are modulating any of these. So green here would be supportive of the goal. Red here is actually holds it back. And clearly you've got things that work on some and not on others. So what you'd want to do is do something along these lines. What are the core modulators around all of this stuff? And work out, okay, well this, let's say this modulator seems to have a real effect on multiple things, because that's worth doing across agencies. Actually, here's one that just seems to rely on so many different things, that's going to be really difficult to get a handle. And then you run experiments based on the modulators. Does that make sense? Yeah. And of course, one of the things I talked about earlier that I get from the bureaucracy is a difficult thing, is working multi-agency. Remember I talked about how important it is to have diversity of thinking. No. You've got it built in. No. I think you're still at the expert level. I still think you can benefit from other things, but actually that becomes really critical with this. So the complex problem, you also cannot break it down. You can't disaggregate it. You're dealing with the whole ecosystem. You've got to work with the system. What I mentioned just now. Understand where you are today. Work out where you might get some traction and move it forward. Work out where the spaces are where you cannot. And often there's so many things, oh, if only. Well, the reality is the reality. Trying to push it to a place that it's not going to go right now is pointless. Trying to push it to a place where it might go now might open up a new avenue that would take you where you want to go. Might also, and often this is the case, will open up even better opportunities you cannot see from where you sit today. But it takes an evolutionary attitude, not an engineering attitude. And that's a big shift. So you want to set directions, but not targets, not fixed future visions. And that's really tough in the environment we work in. And too often, we've all seen it in terms of outcome measures and things like that. People game those to meet the target and pervert the system. In the UK, we've got it on schools, the league tables on schools. A number of schools have just been taken to court because they discovered that they want to be high on the list of what comes out at the end of A-levels when they're 18. So at 17, with a year to go before the exams, they make an assessment, and if you're not at a certain level, you just go. Now that's illegal, but nevertheless, many schools were doing it because they had to meet their targets. We've all seen it. We adapt the urban development we do to suit the landscape we find when we get there. Got what? Kigali, Bogota, Amsterdam, and of course here. It has to change. There are certain constraints that we want. Has to be able to commerce, living spaces, leisure spaces, all sorts of other things we know have to be in there, but how we deliver them in each of those is different. Whether it's a transport system or the electrics or anything else. And we need to do the same, therefore, in terms of the behavior of people to adapt. We can have the same similar principles and constraints that we want to get: justice, democracy, human rights, gender equality. But we have to adapt to the mental and social landscape we're working with here. So this is stuff we produced out of SenseMaker, working with people to work out where are they likely to go, where can they not go. So this is, it's actually from a different situation, so I changed the labels on this to make it understandable here, but you can see what I'm trying to say. If, for instance, we're trying to say what we want is people who are willing to engage in the democratic process, you want to take them over this way. As a Boy Scout, I learned that when you've got really tight contour lines, that's a really steep gradient. Okay, so things in here are in a valley that's really tough to get out of. So you want to incentivize them across here, I don't think there's any point. If you incentivize here, actually it's easier to slip back than it is to move that way. So what we want to do, and these are the same materials, but based on what is the problem you're facing right now. So if right now I'm looking around and going, well, everything is unfair, well, then you've got something else you're going to have to deal with before you can even start to think about trying to engage in democracy. If you've got major corruption in your country and you go, participate in the democratic process, they're going to go, yeah, because that's just for the politicians' benefit. You can see how that would actually degrade what you're trying to do. However, if people are already engaged with their community, you can see how you can start, the contours make it possible to go here, or maybe that. So you want to understand what is the mental landscape, the narrative landscape we're working with. Where is it impossible to take them? Where might we take them as our adjacent possible, our first step, where they are naturally inclined to go? And the thing about what I use here with the SenseMaker is each of these dots is an individual example of someone's life. So if I say, we would like to have more here and fewer here, I can look at the stories and say, oh, this is what's going on in their world, in their life. It's how we did the Bangladesh piece. Because we came up with none of the above in terms of improving health, reducing risk, reducing illness, discussed. But then we had a bunch of stories that people said, I really like poetry. Poetry is really important in how I live my life. And we went, well, what the hell are they about? And then you look at those and you start to go, oh, that's not what we expected. And we've seen that elsewhere. We've seen that in Jordan, we've seen it in Libya, we've seen it in Rwanda. It's often the case. If once you understand the landscape you're working with, you can work out what's worth doing and what's frankly not worth bothering with just yet. So, okay, the fonts have shifted slightly in the transition to PowerPoint. I apologize. So, if this is what they're worried about, you're not going to be able to improve things. If that's what they're worried about, you're more likely to make things worse as you try and make them better. Okay. But some of the others will get you other ways. So what do you actually want to do with all of this? Take oblique approaches, not direct ones. That's so counterintuitive, but it is absolutely critical. Understand the landscape of the system. look at the modulators, although you could also look at the constraints, the attractors. There are other ways of looking at the system, but I think the modulators are often the ones that we can do better with. You'll need an effective feedback system for all of this, because if you're running experiments, you need to know whether they're working or not, or at least what effect they're having. Going back to your question earlier about impact. And you can't afford a gameable system in which everybody knows what you're after, because they'll make sure they get it. And what do you need to be able to do that? You need good data. Detailed data that includes context and reality. It's not the same as a questionnaire. Questionnaires, people know what answer you're looking for. And often, the act of asking the question changes the way they're thinking about the problem. Great example is from Starbucks. So Starbucks many years ago used to ask their customers, how do you like your coffee? And everyone comes back and goes, we like our coffee black. And they look at their salespeople and go, but that's not true. People were not lying. They were saying what they genuinely believed. But if you go out and say, tell me about the last coffee you had. Oh, well, that was a cappuccino. Suddenly you get a better correlation. You don't ask the question of what do you think is going on, what do you think of your government? I think they're great. Okay, maybe not here. I had this conversation with a military guy who's going, I don't understand, we did all this research in Iraq and everybody was supportive of the government, then we had the election and it all changed. I said, yeah, you asked the question. You know, frankly, anybody comes up to me in the street and asks me a question, I'm going to give what I think is the socially acceptable answer for the person I'm talking to. We do it automatically. You need to have diverse perspectives, which includes going outside of our usual groups. Bringing new thinkers, bringing people who are familiar with the detail on the ground as well. We saw this in Jordan recently. We had a great one. We were playing back results to implementing partners in Jordan, beneficiaries, directed beneficiaries, and government officials. And one of the things that came out was people saying, we think that in getting a sustained livelihood and providing for our families, it's vital to have good financial capital. In many examples, we have lots of financial capital, but the outcome of the story is still really negative. An implementing partner is going, it's rubbish data, it can't be true. How can you need lots of finance? You've got lots of finance, and you're still unhappy. And then we looked at the narratives. With the beneficiaries looked and went, yeah, that makes sense. I'm a Syrian refugee. I've got loads of financial capital in Syria. Or others going, you've given me lots of money. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I still don't have any dignity. I don't have a job. What do I do now? Money is not sufficient. Well, that makes complete sense. But too often we get trapped. You need people on the ground, and you need those fast feedback mechanisms as well. And I think I think we'll skip the last couple, okay, for time reasons, because as always, I talk too much. You're looking to evolve the whole system, not find a solution. The solution needs to come from within the system through the way you have nudged it and helped it to evolve. In that way, it's also more resilient. It's also usually less cost than if you're trying to impose a solution. I mentioned experiments may have positive unintended consequences, so you need to be watching broader, scanning more, because it may be having an effect you never thought was going to happen, but wow, doesn't that help? We did it in Mexico. We wanted people to think more about the future. And we did it by just sort of nudging school kids to tell a story they thought might be true and they might see in the newspaper in 6 months' time. And one of the things we saw as a result of that, they started to think about how do you stop bad things happening, deterrent effect, which was not what we were trying to drive, but was a really positive unintended consequence, given what we knew about that city. If you find that your experiment seems to have the same result wherever you run it, actually, congratulations, you may have found something that was complicated all along. In which case, make a process and transition it, but keep an eye on it. There's too many things we try and transplant from Kyrgyzstan to the Balkans, and it doesn't work. But there's some that will. But if you're going to do that, make sure you know why it worked and what it's dependent on in that environment. Things like the Korean bank didn't transplant to Africa. because the trust structures are so different from where we start. And often if you're doing this and you do an evolutionary approach, you will have better resilience in the community of your solution, of what you've done, because it will have evolved naturally and people will have fallen into that rather than had it imposed on them. Okay, I think that's enough. I suspect you thinking that was more than enough about 20 minutes ago, but that's okay. One of the things I would say is don't look for the perfect answer. If you're working in a complex system, you cannot get obsessed with the right thing. You've got to go with the good enough next step that's smart. And sometimes our managers and our seniors will go, no, we need to do better than that. Yes, we do. But we can't do it from here. Let's move that landscape first, and then we can do better again. Does that help?
It does.
Sorry. Ben said you guys were good and would get it. So you did. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. That was both inspiring and complicated to actually go through all the layers. I really found myself thinking, how do I translate this into the everyday type work we do with the UN that you're very familiar with? And I think we're very good at breaking things down into simple tasks, simply because we're process managers for the most part. There's a lot of us that deal with process. We've got a workshop to get through tomorrow, so I think we're able to address certain elements of non-complexity, and we keep missing that forest for some of the trees, right? I mean, if I can put it in simpler terms. One thing I'd love you to take a look at some point is the extensive guidance that we've been working on as an organization, certainly UNDP, but also the UNDG system, on what we call theory of change. Mm-hmm. What is the theory of change and the causality and the different elements of solutions pathways? I think a lot of that is a genuine attempt to bring down to reality some of the thinking that you've presented to us. But in many ways, it also gets hung up in the complexity of things and trying to get to the right solution. So the last note you sort of mentioned to me really spoke to me, because it's in many of the constrained situations that we work with, it's about making a decision of some kind that might move the needle a little bit. Hopefully, the right movement of that, But I have come to believe that a lot of the theory of change mentality sometimes is not always helpful, because it does not actually do justice to the complexity, the very complexity it's trying to address, and so on. But thanks very much. We do have a little bit of time, I think, to open it for a few questions.
One
so we
round
take
of questions.
one or two questions, if anyone wants to come in from your perspective. Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jennifer with UNFPA. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. It's eye-opening. Just curious, I like how you framed, instead of saying, fail and fail fast, you framed this safe to fail. The word fail makes people very anxious.
Yep.
So do you have any suggestions on maybe, I don't know if that would need to be repackaged in some way, or how to present it to people who are perhaps unfamiliar with the space?
I think you're absolutely right. It's one of the things that I come across a lot, and I think repackaging is always that's a complex problem, to be perfectly honest, because there are some places I know who are, we can run some experiments about that, and they're quite happy with the experiment word. There's others who go, that sounds awfully formal. That's not what we're interested in. You go, well, how about we run a pilot project? Pilot project we can do. Yeah, pilots are okay. Okay, fine. Other people go, oh, God, pilots again? We've done pilots. We did so many pilots. No, we're not doing any more pilots. Okay, how about, can we try a new idea? Yeah, we can do a trial. No. So I think it's one of those things that lots of people get a knee-jerk reaction to the F word. And if you think that's the case, don't go there. Basically, what you need to do is whatever it takes to be able to create some space to try something without fully knowing what's going to happen as a result. Now, I think that's one of the problems that I think about in every organization I ever worked with. Whenever I went to a boss, some were better than others, if you came up with a plan that's like 99% great, you get funding. Despite the fact in your heart of hearts, this is not going to go that way. It's not going to go the way I just planned it. This is not the way it's going to happen on play. the paper version is great. Then I will meet reality and it will be different. If you went instead and say, look, can I have a fraction of that funding to try something new on this? Most managers I know would have gone, why? And I'd have had to do a whole lot more justification. People would justify things that look solid, that are built on sand. So I think part of, we have a mindset thing going on. It's whatever it takes to get funding and space and some time.
That's right.
To do it. I'm standing up in a couple of weeks talking to a bunch of people in the UK who are sort of local government. And I said, you actually need to put aside 10% of your resources and your time. And that, and the biggest resource is often time to run new things and try new things without knowing what on earth's going to, with an intention of watching what comes out of it, but without knowing with confidence what it will be. In places we've done things like where we've had you have to have a run portfolio of experiments. And if you do that, you might want to say, and you have to have a 20% rate that don't succeed on the terms you expected. And if you fail to meet the 20%, that means you're not casting your net wide enough in terms of your thinking. So therefore, might be a penalty to that. But that's a really tough structure to build in. Worth doing, but not easy.
Maybe one last question.
I have a
Monica?
question which I can hold on to. But I had a question which is, we loved hearing your examples and hearing you speak, but what is your biggest challenge? You're sort of the expert in this field. And how do you sort of address these challenges in moving forward the thinking and the practice on complexity?
So I'm lucky. I have some very bright people like Dave Snowden, like Alicia Herrero and others who are brilliant thinkers on this. One of my challenges is understanding sometimes what they're talking about. But I think the bigger problem, the bigger challenge, which is the one I'm looking at more and more, is what do we do with it? Because theories and thinking is fantastic. Brilliant, congratulations. If it doesn't change what we're doing, and if we haven't worked out how you execute on that, it's not enough. So that for me is my big challenge is, and I'm continually coming up and working with people in particular. It's one of the things, the joys of one of the Silicon Valley projects is being thrown into a room, given a new problem and going, okay, I'm going to use your techniques, I'm going to work it. And just coming up with something new and then formalizing some of that. That's what we're doing more and more. In terms of the outside work we're doing with clients, I think there is a real interest in things like those landscape maps I showed you of people's thinking, which are incredibly valuable. I still think there is a disconnect between that and what happens next. So I know, working with Millie and and Katuna in Tbilisi and some of their colleagues, we've been involved in researching to work out what's going on. But I'm not sure they actually had the capacity to be able to put into place other things. And so one of the things we did in Georgia, we did some work on peace and reconciliation. And some of that was actually pushing the needle there to where people weren't comfortable and going, okay, so what do we do next? And in terms of designing experiments in the room as a result of it, rather than, that was a lovely presentation, thank you very much, we'll now go back.
Right.
And we fall back into our habits. Those are attractive patterns that we've built up over decades of our work. So we have to have ways that break people out of that. We did it in Jordan, we did it in Georgia, and that's effective because you can come out with a wall of ideas of experiments to run around modulators that we think will work. In an ideal world, you'd budget for it in advance. We don't live in the ideal world, and there's no point in trying to fashion an ideal future state. I think that was one of the things I was mentioning. So you work with what you get. And some of them happen and some of them don't. And one thing is coming back to what you were saying earlier, Bernard, that I've seen in other places, people come up with, okay, here are the things we need to do in the obvious space, in the complicated space. And here are the things we think we can start doing in the complex space. And you go back a month later, and the things that were in the obvious space, they're all done. Things in the complicated space, they're well progressed. Things in the complex space are still there.
Absolutely.
It's that execution piece that there are ways of doing it, but not many people are ready for it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That was very inspiring.
Thank you guys.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
We hope to see you again at the next sessions.
So make